It's a nice fake. You a judge? It's a good one. It's not reasonable for someone like you to be driving a car like this out here.
The Arizona sun was a relentless white-hot force, bleaching the color from the sky and turning the asphalt of Route 87 into a shimmering, liquid mirage. Inside her pristine black Lexus, the air conditioning was a quiet hum of civilization against the vast, rugged emptiness of the Tonto National Forest. Federal Judge Eleanor Vance, at 58, was not a woman given to flights of fancy. Her life was a testament to logic, precedent, and the unyielding structure of the law. She was driving from a judicial conference in Phoenix back to her home in Payson, a 2-hour journey through a landscape of saguaro cacti and distant purple-hazed mountains. Her mind was occupied not with the scenery, but with the complex appellate arguments from a RICO case she'd heard that morning. The law was her landscape, a terrain she had navigated with precision and integrity for 3 decades. That is why the sudden, visceral jolt of red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror felt like such a profound disconnect from reality. It was an intrusion, a dissonant chord in the well-orchestrated symphony of her day. She glanced at her speedometer, 66 miles per hour in a 65 zone. A minor infraction, certainly, but unusual for her. She was meticulous. She signaled, smoothly guided the Lexus onto the gravel shoulder, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the approaching crunch of boots on stone. Through her side mirror, she saw not a state trooper or a county sheriff, but 2 figures in the dark green uniforms of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. They were young, fit, and moving with the kind of rigid, purposeful gait that suggested they were confronting a significant threat, not a woman in a business suit driving a luxury sedan. One agent, tall and broad-shouldered with a severe crew cut, approached her driver's side window. His name tag read Brennan. The other, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, stayed back near the rear of her vehicle, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. Her name tag read Jenkins. Judge Vance pressed the button to lower her window, the cool, conditioned air of her car immediately swallowed by the desert's oppressive heat. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm and measured, the same tone she used to address counsel in her courtroom. Agent Brennan did not return the greeting. He leaned down, his sunglasses masking his eyes, his expression a flat, unreadable mask. "Ma'am, do you know how fast you were going?" "I believe I may have been a mile or 2 over the speed limit, officer. My apologies." He ignored her apology. His gaze swept from her face, across the leather interior of her car and back. It was a look of appraisal, but not for any traffic violation. It was a look of suspicion, a look that questioned her very presence in this car, on this road. "License and registration." The words were a command, not a request. Judge Vance reached for her purse on the passenger seat, her movements deliberate and slow. She had presided over enough suppression hearings to know how quickly these encounters could escalate, how a sudden movement could be misinterpreted. She retrieved her wallet and the vehicle registration from the glove compartment. She handed them over. Brennan took the documents but barely glanced at them. His attention was fixed on her. "Where are you coming from?" "A judicial conference in Phoenix." "A judge?" The corner of his mouth twitched, a barely perceptible smirk. "And where are you headed?" "To my home, in Payson." "You live in Payson?" The question was loaded with disbelief. He looked at her car again, then at her, a black woman in a tailored navy suit. The unspoken calculus was clear in his posture, in his tone. In his mind, the pieces didn't fit. "For 15 years, she replied, her voice still even, betraying none of the cold knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. This was no longer about speeding. This was about something else entirely. Brennan handed her license and registration back, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle." The request was a jarring escalation. There was no legal justification for it. "Officer, may I ask why?" The mask of professionalism, thin as it was, finally dropped. Brennan's voice became hard, edged with an authority he clearly felt was being challenged. "Because I told you to. We're conducting a citizenship check. Step out of the car, now." A citizenship check, on a federal highway 80 miles from the border. The words hung in the blistering air, an absurdity so profound, so nakedly pretextual, that for a moment Judge Vance was speechless. She, a United States federal judge, appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, was being ordered out of her car to prove she belonged in her own country. The desert sun beat down, but a different kind of chill, one born of a deep and familiar injustice, began to spread through her. The glare of the flashing lights seemed to mock the very foundations of the world she had spent her entire life defending. The demand to exit her vehicle was not just an unlawful order. It was a deliberate act of intimidation. Judge Eleanor Vance understood this with the chilling clarity of a lawyer dissecting a flawed legal argument. The Fourth Amendment, the bedrock of privacy and protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, was being casually discarded on a sun-scorched patch of Arizona gravel. She took a slow, centering breath. Her courtroom was a place of order, where rules and evidence governed. This roadside encounter was its antithesis, a place of arbitrary power, where a badge was being wielded like a crown. "Agent," she began, her voice retaining its judicial calm. "Under what reasonable suspicion are you conducting a citizenship check? We are nearly 100 miles from the international border." She wasn't just asking a question, she was citing law without citing it, reminding him of the legal standard he was required to meet. Agent Brennan's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being questioned, especially not by a woman, and certainly not by a black woman, who in his worldview should have been compliant and intimidated. "Ma'am, our authority under federal law allows us to conduct checks within a reasonable distance of the border. 100 miles is considered reasonable." He recited the line as if from a script, a hollow justification he had likely used dozens of times before. "The Supreme Court has also been clear that such stops cannot be based on race or ethnicity," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "You have my driver's license, issued by the state of Arizona. You have my registration. There is no basis for this escalation." Brennan's partner, Agent Jenkins, shifted her weight behind the car. Judge Vance could see her in the side mirror, a flicker of uncertainty in her posture. Jenkins knew this was wrong. She had to. But she remained silent, a bystander to her partner's overreach. "Are you refusing to comply with a federal agent?" Brennan's voice dropped, taking on a more menacing tone. He was turning her assertion of rights into an act of defiance. "I am asserting my constitutional rights," Judge Vance corrected him gently, but with an undercurrent of steel. "However, I also do not wish for this situation to escalate unnecessarily." She knew that in this imbalanced power dynamic, being legally right was no guarantee of safety. "I am a federal judge for the District of Arizona. I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding." With the same deliberate slowness as before, she reached into her jacket pocket and retrieved a second wallet. From it, she produced her judicial credentials, a laminated card bearing her photograph, her name, the seal of the United States courts, and her official title. She held it out to him. "This is my identification. If you call the federal courthouse in Phoenix, my clerk can verify my identity and my schedule for today." Brennan took the ID. He held it, turning it over in his hands. He looked at the photograph, then at her. The smirk returned, wider this time, laced with open contempt. "This is a nice fake," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "They sell these online for $50. You a judge? That's a good one." The insult was so profound, so dismissive of her entire life's work, that it momentarily took her breath away. He hadn't just questioned her citizenship, he was now erasing her identity, her achievements, her very station in the society she served. He was reducing her to a caricature, a fraud. "Agent Brennan," she said, her voice now losing its careful neutrality and taking on the sharp edge of command she used to silence a disruptive courtroom. That is the official identification of a sitting United States federal judge. Your refusal to acknowledge it is an act of staggering ignorance. Your continuation of this detention without cause is a violation of federal law. You are exposing yourself and your agency to significant legal liability. Her words, clear and precise, hung in the air. She saw Agent Jenkins take a half-step forward, a silent plea to her partner. But Brennan was too far gone, his ego too deeply engaged. He was a man who saw the world through a prism of suspicion, and Judge Vance's confident articulation of the law only confirmed his biased narrative. To him, she was too articulate, too composed, too wealthy-looking to be what she claimed. She didn't fit his stereotype. He tossed the judicial ID back through the window. It landed on the passenger seat with a soft thud. I don't care if you say you're the President of the United States. You fit a profile. Now I am giving you a final lawful order. Step out. Officer, the car. He unclipped the strap on his holster. It was a small movement, but it was an unmistakable escalation from intimidation to a direct threat of force. Judge Vance looked at the hand resting on the weapon, then back at his face, now contorted with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. The law, her shield and her sword for 30 years, felt utterly useless against this raw, undisguised prejudice. In this moment, she was not a judge. She was just another black body on the side of a road, at the mercy of a man with a badge, a gun, and a deep-seated belief that she did not belong. To understand the sheer magnitude of the insult Agent Brennan had just delivered, one had to understand the journey of Judge Eleanor Vance. Her life was not a series of accidents or lucky breaks. It was a meticulously constructed edifice of intellect, discipline, and an unshakable belief in the promise of American justice, even when that justice was flawed. The robe she wore in her courtroom was more than just fabric. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent mastering the very system that was now being turned against her. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in the late 1960s, Eleanor's earliest memories were of stories told by her parents, stories of marches, of hoses, of churches bombed, and of the quiet, resilient dignity of a people demanding their rightful place. Her father was a high school history teacher, her mother a librarian. Their home was a sanctuary of books, where the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin sat alongside the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. They didn't just teach her to read, they taught her to critically analyze, to question injustice, and to see the law not as a static set of rules, but as a dynamic battleground for the soul of the nation. She was a star student, driven by a quiet but fierce ambition. She graduated summa cum laude from Spelman College and went on to Harvard Law School, where she excelled, making law review and graduating in the top 10% of her class. While many of her peers chased lucrative careers at corporate law firms in New York and Washington, D.C., Eleanor felt a different calling. She returned to the South, taking a position as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Alabama. For 12 years, she worked as an assistant U.S. attorney, earning a reputation as a formidable, fair, and relentlessly prepared prosecutor. She didn't just try cases, she dismantled them, piece by piece, with airtight logic and a commanding courtroom presence. She prosecuted white-collar criminals who defrauded the elderly, corrupt politicians who sold their office for cash, and violent drug trafficking organizations that terrorized communities. She was known for her unwavering ethical compass, never overcharging, always ensuring Brady disclosures were made, and treating every defendant with the dignity the law afforded them. She believed that the power of the state was an immense and fearsome thing, and it had to be wielded with surgical precision and profound responsibility. Her success did not go unnoticed. In her early 40s, she was appointed to the federal bench by a president who was looking for candidates with not just brilliant legal minds, but with real-world experience and a demonstrated commitment to justice. Her confirmation hearing was a testament to her reputation. She received bipartisan support, with senators from both sides of the aisle praising her integrity and judicial temperament. For the next 15 years, she served as a United States District Judge for the District of Arizona, a state she had moved to with her husband, a respected cardiologist. Her courtroom was a model of efficiency and decorum. Lawyers who appeared before her knew they had to be prepared. She had no patience for theatrics or sloppy legal work. Her rulings were known for their intellectual rigor, their clarity, and their deep respect for constitutional principles. She was tough but fair, demanding but compassionate. She sentenced criminals to prison, but she also listened to their stories, often expressing her hope for their rehabilitation. She presided over complex patent disputes, adjudicated bitter water rights battles, and oversaw sensitive national security cases. She had sworn an oath, placing her hand on a Bible that had been in her family for generations, to administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. It was an oath she lived by every single day. The weight of the robe and the power of the gavel were, to her, a sacred trust. She had sent people to prison. She had ordered corporations to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Her signature on a warrant could authorize the search of a home, the seizure of property. She wielded the full power of the United States government, a power she understood intimately and respected profoundly. And now, that entire life, the hard-won honors, the decades of service, the solemn oath, was being negated on the side of a highway by a man whose only authority came from a uniform and a gun. He had called her life's work a good one, a joke. He had looked at the symbol of her office, an office that represented the very stability and fairness of the nation, and dismissed it as a $50 fake. The irony was a physical weight, pressing down on her in the suffocating desert heat. Agent Brennan wasn't just detaining a citizen, he was spitting on the institution she embodied. He was, in his ignorance and prejudice, attacking the very rule of law he was sworn to uphold. Judge Vance's belief in the Constitution wasn't an abstract academic principle. It was a conviction forged in the crucible of her courtroom, tested and tempered by the complex, often messy reality of human conflict. As she sat in her car, the engine silent, staring at the impassive face of Agent Brennan, her mind flashed back to the cases that had defined her career, cases that underscored the profound and tragic irony of this roadside confrontation. She remembered United States versus Morales, a brutal drug conspiracy case from early in her tenure. The lead defendant was a menacing figure, the head of a cartel faction accused of multiple murders. The evidence was strong, but much of it was circumstantial. The government's star witness was a low-level dealer who had turned informant. During a grueling cross-examination, the defense attorney uncovered inconsistencies in the informant's testimony, suggesting he might be fabricating details to secure a lighter sentence. The prosecution's case began to look shaky. The U.S. Attorney's Office, desperate for a conviction, pressured her to limit the scope of the cross-examination, to disallow certain lines of questioning. Judge Vance had refused. In her chambers, she had lectured the young, ambitious prosecutors. "The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to confront one's accuser," she had told them, her voice calm but unyielding. "That right is not a suggestion. It is absolute. If your case cannot withstand a vigorous cross-examination, then it is not a case worthy of a conviction in a United States court." The jury, after hearing the full, unimpeded testimony, acquitted Morales on the most serious charges. It was an unpopular verdict. She received threats. But she had never once doubted her decision. She had upheld the Constitution, even for a man she personally found repulsive. Then there was the ACLU versus Maricopa County School District case, a contentious First Amendment battle. A group of high school students had started an unofficial satirical newspaper that was highly critical of the school's administration. The principal, citing concerns about disruption and disrespect, had suspended the students and banned the publication. The case landed in her courtroom. The school district's lawyers argued that administrators needed broad authority to maintain order. The ACLU argued for the students' right to free speech. Judge Vance's ruling became a landmark in the state. She wrote, "The classroom is not a constitutional free zone. Our schools are meant to be the nurseries of democracy. To teach students about their rights in a civics class while punishing them for exercising those rights in the hallway is the height of hypocrisy. The speech in question may be sophomoric and irritating to those in power, but the First Amendment was not written to protect popular or polite speech. It was written to protect precisely the kind of speech that challenges authority." She had sided with the students, reaffirming that the rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights belong to everyone, not just those an authority figure deemed worthy. She thought of the countless immigration and naturalization ceremonies she had presided over, perhaps the most joyous part of her job. She would look out from the bench at a sea of faces, people from every corner of the globe, their eyes filled with hope and emotion. They had studied, they had waited, they had navigated a labyrinthine bureaucracy, all for this moment. Before administering the oath of allegiance, she always made it a point to speak to them directly, not as a judge to litigants, but as a citizen to her newest compatriots. "In many of the countries you came from," she would say, her voice warm, "the law is a tool of the state, used to control the people. In the United States, at its best, the law is the property of the people, used to control the state. The Constitution is not a gift from the government to you. It is a set of instructions from you to your government, telling it what it may and may not do. Never forget that. It is your power. It is your protection." Her own words now echoed in her mind with a painful, hollow resonance. Your protection. Where was that protection now? She had spent her career forcing the government to obey its own rules, to respect the lines drawn by the Constitution. She had defended the rights of accused murderers, of rebellious teenagers, of new immigrants. She had been the guardian of the process, the guarantor of fairness. Now she was the one being subjected to the arbitrary exercise of state power she had so often reined in from the bench. Agent Brennan, with his groundless suspicions and his hand on his gun, was the very embodiment of the unchecked authority she had fought against her entire professional life. He was not just violating her rights, he was desecrating the sacred principles that she had spent 30 years defending for others. The fire that had forged her judicial philosophy was now threatening to consume her on the side of a desolate highway. The standoff was absolute. Judge Vance, a bastion of the law, sat in her car, while Agent Brennan, its supposed enforcer, stood outside, a monolith of unyielding suspicion. The air between them was thick with more than just heat. It was charged with the toxic energy of prejudice. The initial pretext of a speeding violation had long since evaporated, leaving behind the ugly, raw truth of the encounter. This was about race, class, and a worldview that could not reconcile a black woman with a Lexus and a claim to judicial authority. "Sir," Judge Vance said, making one last attempt to appeal to reason, though she knew it was likely futile. "I am not a threat. I am a citizen, an officer of the court, on my way home. There is no lawful reason for you to order me out of this vehicle. Let's all be reasonable." The word reasonable seemed to trigger something in Brennan. For him, this entire situation was beyond the pale of his reason. In his world, things were simpler. There were good guys and bad guys, citizens and aliens, people who belonged and people who were suspect. Judge Vance, with her calm defiance and articulate assertion of rights, had crossed a line in his mind. She wasn't behaving the way a suspect was supposed to behave. He leaned in closer to the window, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Reasonable? You want to talk about reasonable? It's not reasonable for someone like you to be driving a car like this in this area. It's not reasonable for you to be carrying a fake judge ID. This is America. We have a right to know who's really in our country." There it was, the poison, finally uncorked. Someone like you, a car like this, who's really in our country. It was the classic toxic cocktail of racial and class-based resentment, thinly veiled as patriotic duty. He wasn't just questioning her citizenship in the legal sense, he was questioning her belonging in the American tapestry itself. He was telling her that, in his eyes, she was an anomaly, an outsider who had to justify her own success, her own existence. The remark landed like a physical blow. For all her composure, for all her intellectual defenses, the raw bigotry of the statement cut through. It was the same ugly sentiment she had encountered in whispers and sideways glances throughout her life, the same poison that had fueled the injustices her parents had fought against. But she had never had it thrown in her face with such raw, official power behind it. Behind Brennan, Agent Jenkins flinched. The mask of neutrality she had worn shattered. Her partner had just crossed a bright red line, verbalizing the prejudiced basis for the stop and making their position legally indefensible. She looked from Brennan's rigid back to the composed, dignified woman in the car. Jenkins opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The moment hung there, a fragile bubble of potential intervention, and then it popped. She remained silent. Judge Vance's expression hardened. The last vestige of the patient citizen trying to de-escalate vanished, replaced by the steely resolve of a judge who had just witnessed an undeniable injustice. The time for reason was over. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a malicious act. "Agent Brennan," she said, and her voice was now pure ice. "You have just articulated a discriminatory basis for this stop. You have admitted that your suspicion is based on my race and my perceived economic status. This entire encounter is being recorded by my vehicle's dash camera, which records both audio and video. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words and actions." The mention of a camera seemed to momentarily stun him. He glanced at her dashboard, his eyes searching, but his arrogance quickly overrode any flicker of caution. He likely assumed she was bluffing. "I don't care about your camera," he snarled, though a seed of doubt had been planted. "My order stands. Get out of the car, now, or I will remove you." He reached for his door handle. The situation was about to escalate from a verbal confrontation to a physical one. Judge Vance knew she had a choice. She could continue to refuse, risking being forcibly dragged from her car, injured, and arrested on trumped-up charges of resisting. Or she could comply under protest, preserving her physical safety while continuing to gather the evidence that would ultimately destroy his career. She made the calculated decision of a strategist. This battle would not be won on the side of this highway. It would be won in a courtroom, her arena, where his prejudice would be exposed not by shouting, but by the cold, hard light of evidence. With a final, withering look of contempt for the man before her, she unlocked her door. "I am complying under duress and under protest," she stated clearly for the record. "This detention is unlawful and discriminatory." She pushed the door open and began to step out onto the soil of the country she served, a country that, in this moment, was treating her like an enemy. Agent Sarah Jenkins stood 10 feet away, a silent witness to a constitutional train wreck. Every fiber of her training, every principle she thought she believed in, was screaming that this was wrong. She had seen the driver's Arizona license. She had seen the registration. She had seen the woman's calm, professional demeanor. And she had seen, with sickening clarity, the judicial credentials that her partner, Kyle Brennan, had contemptuously tossed back into the car. She knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in her gut, that they were illegally detaining a federal judge. Jenkins was 32, with 7 years in the Border Patrol. She'd joined up, like many, out of a sense of patriotic duty and a desire for a stable, respectable career. She wasn't a hothead like Brennan. She saw her job as a necessary, if sometimes difficult, part of national security. She had been partnered with Brennan for 6 months, and in that time, she had grown increasingly uneasy. He saw the world in black and white, a binary of us versus them. He had a sixth sense for finding contraband, but his instincts were inextricably tangled with his prejudices. His hunches almost always targeted people of color in vehicles that he deemed too nice or out of place. She'd tried to talk to him about it once, a few months back, after a particularly aggressive stop of a black family in a new minivan near Tucson. "Kyle, we gotta be sure we have real reasonable suspicion, not just a feeling," she had said tentatively. He had laughed it off. "Jenks, you're too soft. You gotta trust the gut. My gut keeps this country safe." His gut, she had come to realize, was just a repository for a lifetime of unexamined biases. Now, as Judge Vance stepped out of the Lexus, her movements graceful and deliberate despite the circumstances, Jenkins felt a wave of shame. Brennan's words, "someone like you, who's really in our country," echoed in her ears. He had said the quiet part out loud. He had laid their agency bare to a lawsuit that they would and should lose spectacularly. She had a duty to intervene. The CBP manual was clear. Officers had a responsibility to de-escalate and to stop fellow officers from violating policy or law. She took a half step forward, the words forming on her lips. "Kyle, stop. Let's run the ID. Let's just call it in. It would be so simple. A 2-minute phone call could end this." But she stopped. The invisible chains of partnership, of the blue line, of not wanting to be labeled a rat or disloyal, held her fast. Brennan was senior to her. He was aggressive and vindictive. Crossing him would mean a world of trouble. He would make her life a living hell, labeling her as someone who couldn't be trusted in the field, sabotaging her chances for promotion. The path of least resistance was silence, and so she chose it. She watched as Brennan directed Judge Vance to the rear of the vehicle. "Hands on the trunk." Judge Vance placed her hands on the hot metal of her car, her posture erect, her dignity a silent rebuke to the indignity she was suffering. "Agent, on what grounds are you searching my vehicle?" "We're not searching it. Yet," Brennan said. "I'm securing you while I determine your citizenship status." It was a nonsensical statement. He had made no attempt to actually verify her status. He had only rejected the proof she had provided. Jenkins's mind raced. This was her last chance. She could walk up, take the judicial ID from the passenger seat, and use her own radio to call dispatch. She could be the one to end this farce. She could do the right thing. But the fear of reprisal, of the institutional backlash, was a powerful anesthetic. It numbed her conscience, paralyzed her will. She saw her career, her mortgage, her future, and weighed it against the rights of this woman. And in that moment of cowardly calculus, she failed. She became complicit in her silence. She stood by watching as her partner continued his illegal detention. She was no longer just a bystander, she was a participant. Her silence was an endorsement. Her presence lent legitimacy to Brennan's abuse of power. The system she had sworn to uphold was not just failing, she, personally, was failing it. The Arizona sun felt like a spotlight, exposing her not as a guardian of the law, but as a silent accomplice to its violation. The knowledge of her own cowardice would be a stain that no uniform could ever cover. Agent Kyle Brennan was not a product of a vacuum. His actions on that sun-scorched highway were not an aberration. They were the predictable culmination of a career built on a foundation of unchecked aggression and systematically ignored warning signs. To understand why he felt such impunity, one had to look at the file San Bernardino County had on Travis Holbrook in the previous story and see its direct parallel in the file Customs and Border Protection had on Kyle Brennan, a file that told a story of institutional failure for nearly a decade. Brennan was 38 years old. He had been with CBP for 12 years, the last 8 of which were spent on the roving patrol unit operating out of the Tucson sector. In those 12 years, 19 formal complaints had been filed against him by members of the public. 19. Every single one was filed by a person of color, 17 by individuals of Hispanic descent, 2 by African Americans. The pattern was as consistent as it was damning. There was the case of the Martinez family, pulled over on their way to a wedding in Phoenix. Mr. Martinez, a successful architect, was driving his family in their new Lincoln Navigator. Brennan pulled them over for an alleged erratic lane change, detained them for over an hour, and subjected their vehicle to a full search by a drug-sniffing dog, which found nothing. The family was forced to unpack their wedding gifts on the side of the road. Complaint filed, harassment, racial profiling. Result, unfounded. There was the case of Dr. David Chen, a renowned cardiologist from California who was not a person of color in the typical sense but was another victim. A Hispanic college student, Marcus Rivera, was driving his 10-year-old Toyota Camry near Nogales. He was a U.S. citizen, born and raised in Arizona, on his way to his part-time job. Brennan stopped him, claiming his car matched the description of a vehicle used in a human smuggling case. He questioned Rivera in an accusatory tone for 45 minutes, demanding to know who he was working for. Complaint filed. Unlawful detention. Result? Agent acted within policy guidelines. There was the case of the Henderson couple, an elderly black pair driving their RV to a national park. Brennan stopped them for having a partially obscured license plate because a single screw was rusted. He questioned them separately, trying to catch them in a lie about their destination, implying they were trafficking narcotics. They were held for so long they missed their campground reservation. Complaint filed, pretextual stop, age and racial discrimination. Result, agent reminded of courtesy standards. 19 complaints, 19 stories of humiliation. The pattern was undeniable. Brennan targeted people of color in vehicles he deemed either too nice, suggesting drug money, or too old, suggesting smuggling. He operated on a toxic assumption that non-white individuals in certain spaces were inherently suspicious. His supervisors at CBP, however, treated each complaint as an isolated incident. The dots were never connected. His performance evaluations were a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. Agent Brennan is a proactive and highly motivated officer who consistently exceeds enforcement metrics, one review read. The reports praised his high number of stops and seizures. The darker side was relegated to footnotes. Brennan is results-oriented but can be abrasive in his public interactions. Another noted, could benefit from additional training in cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. These notes never translated into meaningful consequences. 6 of the complaints resulted in a letter of counseling, a meaningless document that was filed away and forgotten. 8 were closed as unfounded or insufficient evidence, despite corroborating statements from passengers or family members. 5 were simply lost in the labyrinth of the internal affairs process. 0 resulted in suspension. 0 resulted in demotion. 0 resulted in termination. The system wasn't just failing to punish Brennan, it was actively rewarding him. His high arrest and seizure numbers, achieved through a dragnet of discriminatory stops, were seen as signs of a productive, effective agent. He was lauded by his superiors as a real street cop, a guy who got things done. The complaints from citizens were treated as the inevitable cost of aggressive policing, the whinings of the bad guys he was catching. So Brennan kept patrolling, kept stopping, kept assuming. The lack of consequences reinforced his belief that his gut was infallible and his authority was absolute. He came to believe that the people he pulled over, the ones who complained, were the problem. He was the protector, the thin green line. The Constitution was a set of abstract guidelines for courthouses, not a practical manual for the realities of the highway. Each ignored complaint emboldened him, hardening his prejudices into something he saw as professional instinct. Until the day he targeted someone who couldn't be dismissed, someone whose entire life was a monument to the very laws he was breaking, someone who wouldn't just file a complaint, but would turn it into a federal case that would finally force the system to look at the pattern it had so willfully ignored. Agent Kyle Brennan's prejudice was the spark, but the institution of Customs and Border Protection was the dry tinder and the accelerant. His behavior on Route 87 was not the rogue action of a single bad apple. It was the predictable rotten fruit of a tree cultivated for years in a specific kind of orchard. The culture within CBP, particularly in the vast, quasi-militarized zones of the Southwest, had created the perfect environment for a bully like Brennan not just to survive, but to thrive. The problem began with the agency's mission and its geographic authority. Following the 9/11 attacks, CBP was absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security, and its mission expanded far beyond its traditional role at ports of entry. Congress granted it the authority to operate within a 100-mile zone from any external U.S. boundary. This zone, a constitutional anomaly, covers nearly 2/3 of the American population, including major cities like Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago. Within this zone, agents like Brennan believed they had sweeping, almost unlimited powers to stop and question individuals about their citizenship with little to no suspicion. This legal gray area fostered a culture of aggression. The primary metrics for success at field stations like Brennan's in Tucson were quantitative: the number of stops, arrests, and seizures of cash and contraband. Supervisors, under pressure to produce results, praised agents who were proactive, a euphemism for those who made the most stops. This created a perverse incentive system. An agent who spent his shift carefully developing probable cause for a single solid arrest was seen as less productive than an agent like Brennan, who used flimsy pretexts to stop dozens of vehicles, hoping to get lucky. The dragnet approach was institutionally rewarded. Training, while paying lip service to the Fourth Amendment, often emphasized officer safety and threat identification above all else. Recruits were drilled on worst-case scenarios, taught to view every public encounter as a potential life-or-death confrontation. This warrior mindset, while useful in certain high-risk situations, was disastrous when applied to routine traffic stops of families and commuters. It trained agents to see threats where none existed, to view citizens as potential adversaries, and to equate questioning of their authority with belligerence and resistance. De-escalation was a module in the academy. Aggressive control was the daily reality in the field. Furthermore, the agency's internal disciplinary system was notoriously opaque and ineffective. The complaint process was a bureaucratic black hole. A citizen filing a complaint against an agent would rarely, if ever, receive a substantive response or learn the outcome of the investigation. This lack of transparency created a shield of impunity. Agents knew that unless they did something truly egregious and it was caught on camera, the odds of facing any real consequences were vanishingly small. A complaint was just paperwork. A letter of counseling was a joke. The system was designed to protect its own. This environment was the perfect incubator for Brennan's confirmation bias. Every time his aggressive, discriminatory tactics yielded a minor drug bust or the discovery of a person who had overstayed their visa, it reinforced his belief that his gut was right. The dozens of innocent people he harassed in the process were just collateral damage, the necessary cost of keeping the country safe. His fellow agents, even those like Jenkins who harbored private doubts, were reluctant to challenge him. The culture of solidarity, the fear of being ostracized, and the institutional pressure to produce stats created a powerful conspiracy of silence. So the system didn't just fail to stop Brennan, it actively created him. It handed him a badge, a gun, and a vast swath of the country to patrol. It taught him to be suspicious, aggressive, and to prioritize enforcement over constitutional rights. It rewarded him for the results of his prejudice and insulated him from the consequences of his misconduct. When Agent Brennan looked at Judge Eleanor Vance, a successful black woman, and saw a suspect, he wasn't just seeing her through his own biased eyes. He was seeing her through the distorted lens that his agency had spent 12 years grinding, polishing, and fitting for him. He was the system, personified. As Judge Eleanor Vance stood with her hands on the blistering trunk of her own car, a profound shift occurred within her. The initial shock and the instinct to de-escalate had given way to a cold, crystalline anger. But it was the anger of a strategist, not a victim. She was no longer a citizen pleading for her rights. She was a judge, observing a gross miscarriage of justice, and her mind began to work with the methodical precision she applied to a complex legal case. This roadside was no longer just a scene of her humiliation. It had become a crime scene, and she was its primary witness and investigator. Brennan, puffed up with his perceived victory, circled her vehicle, peering into the windows. "What's in the briefcase on the back seat?" he demanded. "Legal documents and my personal laptop," she replied, her voice steady. Every word was now for the record, for the dash cam, for the lawsuit that was already taking shape in her mind. "You got anything illegal in the car? Drugs? Large amounts of cash? Any weapons?" His questions were a fishing expedition, an attempt to retroactively justify the illegal stop. "No, Agent, I do not," she said. "And you have no probable cause to search my vehicle." She was not just denying his accusation, she was laying a legal trap. By stating the legal standard aloud, she was highlighting his violation of it. Her mind compartmentalized the experience. One part of her was enduring the indignity, the Arizona sun beating down on her, the feeling of vulnerability as cars sped past on the highway, their occupants likely seeing a routine traffic stop, not a constitutional crisis in miniature. But the other, dominant part of her brain was in legal mode. It was a gambit, a calculated shift in strategy. She had given them the chance to be reasonable, and they had rejected it. Now, she would let them have all the rope they needed to hang themselves. She started cataloging details with the meticulousness of a forensic scientist. Time. She glanced at her watch. 1:42 p.m. The stop had been initiated at 1:27 p.m. 15 minutes of unlawful detention so far. Location: Route 87, southbound, near mile marker 224. She noted the specific landscape features: a large saguaro with a missing arm, a distinctive rock outcropping. The agents: Agent Kyle Brennan, white male, late 30s, approximately 6 feet 2 inches, crew cut, aggressive demeanor, name tag clearly visible. Agent Sarah Jenkins, white female, early 30s, approximately 5 feet 8 inches, brown hair in a bun, passive and observant, a silent accomplice. The dialogue. She replayed every word exchanged, searing Brennan's justification. "Someone like you, who's really in our country," into her memory. These were not just insults, they were admissions. They were the heart of her future legal complaint. The vehicle. She noted the number of their CBP patrol vehicle parked behind hers, 7T34. Brennan, having found nothing of interest by looking through the windows, returned to her. He seemed frustrated, annoyed that she wasn't breaking down, that she wasn't providing him with the justification he so clearly craved. "I need to see some proof of citizenship," he said, doubling down on the initial pretext. "A passport, a birth certificate." The demand was patently absurd. No American citizen is required to carry proof of citizenship with them on a domestic highway. "Agent," she said, her tone almost instructional, as if speaking to a law student who had missed the point. "An Arizona driver's license is sufficient identification for a traffic stop. You have seen it. Your continued demands are baseless. You are illegally prolonging this detention." She was building her case, word by word, minute by minute. Each unlawful command he gave, each moment he kept her there, added another layer to the complaint, another dollar figure to the potential damages. She knew that the dash cam was her impartial witness, but her own memory, her own testimony as a trained legal observer would be devastating in court. Brennan seemed to realize he was on shaky ground. He hadn't found anything, she wasn't intimidated, and he had no legal next step. He was a bully who had run out of bluster. He fell silent, standing a few feet away, clearly unsure of what to do next. He had expected to be in control, to dominate the situation. Instead, he found himself in a battle of wills with a woman whose composure was its own form of impenetrable armor. He had pulled over a citizen. He had discovered too late that he had trapped himself with a judge. The power dynamic on that roadside was beginning to invert, not through shouting or resistance, but through the quiet, inexorable power of the law that she embodied. The standoff continued for another 5 agonizingly long minutes. The desert heat was oppressive. Agent Brennan stood silently, his arms crossed, a man trapped in a hole of his own digging, too proud to admit his mistake and too clueless to figure a way out. Agent Jenkins remained a statue of inaction by their patrol vehicle. For Judge Vance, this period of limbo was the most dangerous. It was when a cornered, frustrated officer might do something rash. She needed to reassert control, not through confrontation, but through a calm, decisive action that would pierce their bubble of roadside impunity. "Agent Brennan," she said, her voice breaking the tense silence, "you have detained me for over 20 minutes without cause. You have rejected my official credentials. You have refused to conduct a simple verification. I am now going to use my phone to contact my office." Brennan stiffened. "You're not calling anyone." "That is not a lawful order," she replied flatly, turning her head to look at him. "I am being held against my will. I have the right to contact counsel. In this case, I will be contacting the Chief Clerk of the United States District Court for the District of Arizona. He can and will confirm my identity for you." Before he could object further, she reached into her pocket, retrieved her cell phone, and unlocked it with her thumb. Her movements were calm and deliberate. Brennan took a step towards her, his instinct to control the situation warring with the dawning realization that he was out of his depth. She found the number in her contacts and pressed "call." She put the phone on speaker, the volume loud enough to be clearly audible in the dry desert air. The phone rang twice. "Clerk's office, this is David." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. David Chen, her chief clerk for the past 10 years, a man known for his unflappable competence. "David, it's Judge Vance." There was a slight pause. "Judge, is everything all right? I thought you were on your way home." David's tone was immediately laced with concern. He knew her schedule. He knew she would never call him on his direct line from the road unless it was an emergency. "I'm afraid I've been detained," she said, her voice a perfect model of judicial composure. "I'm on Route 87 near mile marker 224. I've been stopped by 2 agents from Customs and Border Protection. They are Agents Brennan and Jenkins, vehicle number 7T34. She recited the facts with the clarity of a witness giving testimony. "Detained? For what?" David's voice was sharp with alarm. "They are conducting what they call a citizenship check. I have provided them with both my driver's license and my judicial identification, but Agent Brennan here seems to believe they are fraudulent." On the other end of the line, she could hear the furious typing of a keyboard. David was documenting everything. "Judge, are you safe?" "For the moment," she replied. "David, would you be so kind as to inform these agents of my official status as a United States federal judge? Perhaps hearing it from you will be more persuasive." She held the phone out towards Brennan. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The phone call was a portal, instantly transporting the authority of the federal courthouse to this isolated stretch of highway. Brennan and Jenkins were no longer alone with a citizen they could intimidate. They were now on a live, recorded call with the administrative head of a federal court. Their little kingdom of gravel and asphalt had just been invaded by a far greater power. Brennan stared at the phone as if it were a snake. He didn't speak. David's voice filled the void, now cold and official. "This is David Chen, Chief Clerk of the U.S. District Court. To the federal agents present, I can confirm that you have detained Senior United States District Judge Eleanor Vance. She presided over a full docket this morning and was returning from official duties. Your continued detention of a federal judicial officer is a matter of extreme gravity. I am, as we speak, notifying the U.S. Marshal for this district. I suggest you release her immediately." The mention of the U.S. Marshals, the federal agency responsible for protecting the judiciary, was the final blow. The Marshals were not just another law enforcement agency, they were their agency, the ones who provided security for their own courthouses. Brennan's face went pale. The swagger, the arrogance, the self-righteous certainty, it all dissolved in a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. He had not just stopped a citizen, he had illegally detained a federal judge, and now the entire weight of the federal judicial system was about to come crashing down on his head. Agent Jenkins finally moved, stepping forward quickly. "Understood, sir," she said into the phone, her voice strained. "We are concluding the stop now." Brennan looked at Jenkins, then at Judge Vance. He was speechless. He had been so utterly, comprehensively outmaneuvered. He mumbled something incoherent, a mix between an apology and a justification, then turned and walked stiffly back to his vehicle. "Thank you, David," Judge Vance said into the phone. "I will be back in touch shortly." She disconnected the call. Jenkins approached her. "Ma'am, Judge, you are free to go. I apologize for the misunderstanding." Judge Vance looked at the younger agent, seeing not an apology but a desperate act of self-preservation. "Your apology, Agent Jenkins, is noted, as is your silence for the past 30 minutes. Without another word, Judge Vance walked back to her driver's side door, got in, and closed it, the solid thud sealing her back inside her world of order. She started the engine, checked her mirrors, and pulled smoothly back onto the highway, leaving the two agents standing in a cloud of dust and the ruins of their careers. The battle on the roadside was over. The war in the courtroom was just about to begin. The drive back to Payson was a blur. Judge Vance's mind, usually a calm sea of legal thought, was a storm of conflicting emotions, cold rage, profound disappointment, and a weary sense of inevitability. When she arrived home, the familiar comfort of her house, filled with books and art, did little to soothe her. She sat in her study for a long time, the events of the afternoon replaying in her mind. The humiliation was a physical presence, a stain she could feel on her skin. Within an hour of her phone call to David Chen, the institutional gears had begun to grind at a furious pace. Her phone rang. It was the chief judge of her district, expressing his outrage and support. An hour later, the head of the U.S. Marshals for Arizona called, personally apologizing and confirming he had opened an inquiry. By evening, a call came from a high-ranking official at the Department of Homeland Security in Washington, D.C., a man whose title was long and his apology profuse. He assured her that the incident was being taken with the utmost seriousness. Agents Brennan and Jenkins had been placed on administrative duty pending a full investigation by the Office of Professional Responsibility. "Judge Vance, we are deeply sorry for the unacceptable behavior of our agents," the official said. "We will ensure that they are disciplined appropriately. We hope that you will accept our sincerest apologies and consider this matter closed." There it was, the offer, a quiet internal resolution. A few heads would roll, a memo on professionalism would be circulated, and the systemic rot would be left undisturbed. They wanted her to accept a private apology and move on, to be a good team player within the federal system. They wanted to treat her humiliation as a personnel issue, not a constitutional violation. They had mistaken her composure for weakness. They had profoundly misjudged their woman. She spent a sleepless night wrestling with her decision. The easy path was to accept the apology. A lawsuit would be grueling, public, and exhausting. It would require her to step down from the bench temporarily, to become a litigant in the very system she presided over. It would open her life to scrutiny. Pundits and politicians would likely attack her, painting her as a privileged elitist or an anti-police radical. But then she thought about the 19 other complaints in Brennan's file, the ones that had gone nowhere. She thought of the Martinez family, the Henderson couple, and Marcus Rivera. They didn't have a direct line to the chief clerk of the federal court. They couldn't summon the U.S. Marshals with a phone call. Their humiliation had been met with bureaucratic indifference. Their complaints had vanished into the void. She realized that what happened to her was not unique. It was the everyday reality for countless people who lacked her title, her resources, her voice. The only thing unique about her case was her position. Her status as a federal judge gave her a platform, a power that others did not have. To accept a private apology would be to betray them. It would be a selfish act of self-preservation, allowing the system that produced a man like Brennan to continue churning out more of them. Her anger, which had been a cold, hard knot, began to transform. It became a source of fuel, a righteous fire. She had spent her life administering justice for others. Now she had to seek it for herself, and in doing so, for everyone else who had been unjustly stopped on a lonely road, their rights trampled under the heel of a badge. Her personal humiliation was no longer just personal. It was an opportunity, a duty, to force a reckoning. The next morning she made 2 phone calls. The first was to the chief judge, informing him that she would be taking a leave of absence, effective immediately. The second was to Mark Caldwell, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country, a man who had been a friend since their days at Harvard. "Mark," she said when he answered, "it's Eleanor Vance." "Eleanor, to what do I owe the honor?" "I need to hire a lawyer," she said, her voice devoid of any doubt. "I'm filing a federal lawsuit against Customs and Border Protection and 2 of its agents for unlawful detention, racial profiling, and violation of my 4th and 5th Amendment rights." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Mark Caldwell, a man who had argued before the Supreme Court, was momentarily speechless. "My God, Eleanor," he finally said, "what did they do?" "They stopped the wrong woman," she replied, a lifetime of conviction in her voice. "And I'm going to make sure they understand that the Constitution applies to everyone, including them." In that moment, she ceased to be the victim. She became the plaintiff. She picked up the gavel not to preside, but to fight. The filing of Vance versus U.S. Customs and Border Protection et al. Sent shockwaves through the legal and law enforcement communities. A sitting federal judge suing a federal agency was virtually unheard of. It was an audacious, almost revolutionary act. The Department of Justice, which would defend CBP and its agents, knew this was no ordinary civil rights case. They were not up against a typical plaintiff. They were facing an opponent who knew the law as well as they did, who understood every nuance of procedure and precedent, and who could not be intimidated. Mark Caldwell assembled a legal dream team. They worked out of a high-rise office in Phoenix, transforming a conference room into a war room dedicated to Judge Vance's case. The walls were covered in whiteboards, charting timelines, legal arguments, and witness lists. The initial complaint they filed was a masterpiece of legal precision, a devastatingly clear and concise account of the events on Route 87. It alleged a litany of constitutional violations and, crucially, it named not only Brennan and Jenkins as defendants, but also their direct supervisors and the agency itself, arguing a pattern and practice of unconstitutional conduct. The government's first move was predictable. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss, based on the powerful legal doctrine of qualified immunity. This doctrine shields government officials from liability in civil lawsuits unless they have violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right of which a reasonable person would have known. For decades, it had served as a nearly impenetrable shield for law enforcement officers accused of misconduct. The government's argument was simple. Even if the agents made a mistake, a reasonable officer in their position could have believed their actions were lawful. This was the first major battleground. Mark and his team prepared a response that was both a brilliant legal brief and a searing indictment of the doctrine itself. They argued that the right to be free from racially motivated, baseless detentions was as clearly established as any right in the constitutional canon. To suggest a reasonable officer wouldn't know this was an insult to the intelligence of every law-abiding agent. Their brief included a powerful personal declaration from Judge Vance herself. She wrote not as a plaintiff, but as a jurist, explaining the fundamental principles at stake. Qualified immunity was intended to protect officers from frivolous lawsuits in gray areas of the law, she wrote. It was never intended to provide a license for clear-cut, discriminatory conduct in the broad daylight of settled constitutional precedent. If the actions I experienced on Route 87 do not constitute a violation of a clearly established right, then the concept of clearly established rights has lost all meaning. While the legal battle over qualified immunity raged, Mark's team launched an aggressive discovery process. They deposed Brennan and Jenkins. Brennan's deposition was a disaster for the government. He was arrogant, defensive, and his justifications for the stop crumbled under scrutiny. He claimed Judge Vance's driving was suspiciously perfect, a nonsensical statement that was met with disbelief. When asked about his comment, "someone like you," he claimed he was referring to her being a lone female driver, an explanation so transparently false it was laughable. The real bombshell came when Mark's team, through a Freedom of Information Act request and a subsequent court order, finally got their hands on Brennan's complete, unredacted personnel file. The 19 prior complaints, the internal reviews that noted his abrasiveness. The pattern was no longer an allegation. It was a documented fact. They now had the arsenal they needed to show that Brennan was not just an agent who made a one-time mistake, he was a serial violator of rights, and CBP was a negligent guardian that had repeatedly failed to stop him. They also deposed Agent Jenkins. On the stand, under oath, away from the intimidating presence of her partner, she finally broke. Her testimony was quiet, reluctant, but devastating. She admitted she never saw a traffic violation. She admitted she knew the judicial ID was likely real. She admitted she had doubts about the legality of the stop from the beginning. And, in a moment of high drama, when Mark asked her why she didn't intervene, she answered with a single, whispered word: fear. The government's case was beginning to crumble. Their motion to dismiss was denied. The judge presiding over the case, a colleague of Vance's from a neighboring district, wrote a scathing opinion, stating that the facts alleged, if true, represented a profound and shocking abuse of power. The shield of qualified immunity had been pierced. The case was heading to a jury trial. The arsenal was assembled. The stage was set for a public reckoning. The day Judge Eleanor Vance took the witness stand, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with journalists, law students, federal agents, and members of the public. The air was thick with anticipation. For months, the case had been a series of legal filings, depositions, and procedural motions. Now, the human heart of the story was about to be laid bare. She walked to the stand, not in her judicial robes, but in the same navy blue business suit she had worn on the day of the incident. Her presence commanded an immediate silence in the room. She was not entering as Judge Vance, the arbiter of law, but as Eleanor Vance, the citizen, the plaintiff. She took the oath, her voice clear and steady, promising to tell the truth in a room where her own word had once been the final authority. Mark Caldwell conducted the direct examination. He began simply, having her establish her background, her education, her long career, building a foundation of credibility and service for the jury. Then he walked her, step by step, through the events of that afternoon on Route 87. Her testimony was a masterclass in clarity and composure. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She recounted the facts with the precision of a surgeon and the emotional weight of a poet. The jury was captivated. They weren't just hearing a story, they were experiencing it through her eyes. "When Agent Brennan approached your vehicle, how did you feel?" Mark asked. "Initially, I felt confused," she replied. "I assumed I had committed a minor traffic infraction. That feeling quickly changed to apprehension. His demeanor was not that of an officer conducting a routine stop. It was confrontational. It was aggressive. He took your license and registration. Then what did he ask you?" "He asked where I was from and where I was going. When I told him I was a judge coming from a conference, he smirked. His disbelief was palpable." She described showing him her judicial ID. "What was his reaction when you presented him with your credentials as a United States federal judge?" "He took them. looked at them for a moment, and tossed them back into my car. He said they were a nice fake, and that my claim to be a judge was a good one. A low murmur went through the courtroom. The sheer disrespect of the act, recounted in her calm, dignified voice, was more powerful than any outburst of anger could have been. Mark walked her through the most painful part of the encounter. Judge Vance, did Agent Brennan give any reason for his suspicion? She paused, her gaze steady on the jury. Yes, he told me that it wasn't reasonable for someone like me to be driving a car like this in this area. He said, "This is America. We have a right to know who's really in our country." She let the words hang in the air, allowing their full, ugly weight to settle upon the courtroom. She wasn't just quoting him, she was indicting a mindset. She was putting prejudice itself on trial. "What did you understand him to mean by someone like you?" Mark asked gently. "He meant a black woman," she said simply. "He saw my race and the quality of my car, and his mind created a narrative of suspicion that had no basis in fact. He was telling me that, in his America, I did not belong." She concluded her testimony by describing the feeling of utter powerlessness as Brennan ordered her out of the car, his hand on his weapon. "In that moment," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "I was not a judge. My 30 years of service, my knowledge of the law, my oath to the Constitution, none of it mattered. I was just a citizen on the side of the road, and the law was not there to protect me. The law, in the person of Agent Brennan, had become my adversary." When she finished, a profound silence held the courtroom. She had done more than just recount an incident. She had articulated the deep, painful chasm between the promise of American justice and its sometimes brutal reality. She had spoken not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been judged not by their character, but by their color. It was the closing argument of a lifetime, delivered not from the bench, but from the witness stand. 2 days later, it was Agent Kyle Brennan's turn. He walked to the witness stand with a practiced swagger, an attempt to project the confidence of a man who believed he had done nothing wrong. He wore his dress uniform, adorned with service ribbons, a calculated effort to present himself as a dedicated public servant. The government's lawyer led him through a carefully rehearsed direct examination. Brennan portrayed himself as a vigilant agent, a protector of the border who had simply been doing his job. He described Judge Vance's driving as unusually rigid, her adherence to the speed limit as unnatural, a common tactic of smugglers trying to blend in. He painted his own actions as standard procedure. Then, Mark Caldwell rose to cross-examine. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The air crackled with tension. Mark began quietly, almost conversationally. "Agent Brennan, you've been with Customs and Border Protection for 12 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in those 12 years, you've conducted thousands of traffic stops, haven't you?" "That's right. I'm a proactive agent." Brennan puffed out his chest slightly. "Proactive," Mark repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Let's talk about that. Are you familiar with a Mr. Martinez, an architect you stopped with his family in their Lincoln Navigator?" The government lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Relevance!" "Your Honor," Mark countered smoothly, "this goes directly to the agent's pattern and practice, which is a core element of our case against the agency." "Overruled," the presiding judge said. "The witness will answer the question." Brennan's confidence flickered. "I don't recall every stop I make." "Perhaps I can refresh your memory," Mark said, picking up a document. "A complaint filed on May 12th, 3 years ago, alleging you held the family for over an hour and searched their wedding gifts. Does that ring a bell?" "Like I said, I don't recall specifics." Brennan was beginning to squirm. Mark moved on, a predator sensing weakness. "What about Marcus Rivera, the college student in the Toyota Camry? You accused him of being a smuggler, didn't you?" "Objection!" "Overruled." Brennan's face was reddening. "I was investigating a tip. A tip that described a different model car entirely, isn't that right, Agent?" Mark pressed. "Isn't the only thing Mr. Rivera had in common with that tip was that he was Hispanic?" "That's not true." Mark continued relentlessly, bringing up complaint after complaint from Brennan's file. The Henderson couple, the Diaz family. With each example, the narrative of Brennan as a vigilant protector unraveled, replaced by the portrait of a bully with a badge who systematically targeted minorities. The jury watched, their faces growing harder with each revelation. Then Mark shifted to the stop of Judge Vance. Agent Brennan, you testified that you found Judge Vance's driving to be suspiciously perfect. Can you explain to the jury what crime she was committing by obeying the traffic laws? It's just a tactic criminals use. Brennan stumbled over the words. So, in your professional opinion, driving over the speed limit is suspicious, and driving at the speed limit is also suspicious. Is that right, Agent? Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Brennan's face was now crimson. Mark moved in for the kill. Let's talk about your statement, someone like you. You testified that you were referring to her being a lone female driver. Is that still your testimony today, under oath? Yes. Agent Brennan, Mark said, his voice dropping, becoming deadly serious. Isn't it true that in your 12-year career, you have received 19 citizen complaints? And isn't it true that every single one of those 19 complaints was filed by a person of color? Brennan froze. It was a fact he could not deny. I patrol a diverse area. And isn't it true, Mark continued, his voice rising with righteous anger, that when you saw a successful black woman driving a Lexus, you didn't see a fellow citizen, you didn't see a judge, you saw a suspect. Isn't that the truth, Agent Brennan? Brennan stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was completely exposed, his prejudice laid bare for the entire courtroom to see. He looked at the jury, searching for a sympathetic face, and found only cold, judgmental stares. No further questions, Your Honor, Mark said, turning his back on the broken man in the witness box. Brennan's unraveling was complete. He had walked onto the stand as a symbol of federal authority and walked off as a poster child for abuse of power. His own words, and the long, documented history of his actions, had become his condemnation. After the final arguments were made, a hush fell over the courtroom. The presiding judge turned to the jury box. The 12 men and women, a cross-section of Arizona society, a teacher, a retired mechanic, a software engineer, a stay-at-home mom, had sat in rapt attention for 2 weeks. They had listened to the calm, dignified testimony of Judge Vance and the flustered, self-serving excuses of Agent Brennan. They had seen the personnel files, the dashcam video, and the pained, reluctant admissions of Agent Jenkins. Now, the full weight of the case was being transferred to them. Members of the jury, the judge began, his voice solemn, you have heard the evidence and the testimony. It is now your duty to retire to the jury room and deliberate. You must weigh the facts presented and apply the law as I have instructed you. You are to judge this case not on sympathy or prejudice, but on the evidence alone. Your verdict will represent the conscience of this community. The jury filed out, their faces grave, etched with the seriousness of their task. The heavy oak door of the jury room closed behind them with a decisive click, sealing them off from the world. For everyone else, Judge Vance, her legal team, the government lawyers, the press, there was nothing left to do but wait. The wait was a unique form of torture. For Judge Vance, it was a profound role reversal. She had spent 15 years on the other side of that closed door, waiting for juries to return with verdicts that would alter the course of people's lives. She understood the weight of their deliberation, the complex alchemy of logic, emotion, and human experience that went into a collective decision. But knowing the process did little to ease the anxiety of being its subject. Hours crawled by. The first hour. The second. The lawyers made small talk, drank stale coffee, and checked their phones endlessly. Judge Vance sat with Mark Caldwell in the nearly empty courtroom, a portrait of calm on the outside, but inside, her mind was a tempest. She had done everything she could. She had stood up, spoken her truth, and exposed the injustice. But her fate, and the larger principle for which she fought was no longer in her hands. It rested with 12 ordinary citizens. What were they discussing in that room? Were they debating the nuances of the Fourth Amendment? Were they arguing about the credibility of Agent Brennan? Or were they wrestling with their own experiences, their own biases, their own beliefs about law enforcement and race in America? A single juror, holding a deeply ingrained belief that police can do no wrong, could hang the jury, resulting in a mistrial. All her effort could end in an unsatisfying, inconclusive draw. By late afternoon, the tension was almost unbearable. Every time the door to the courtroom opened, heads would snap up, only to see it was just a clerk or a bailiff. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, a note was passed from the jury room to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom, which had emptied out during the long wait, quickly filled up again. A frantic energy buzzed through the room as lawyers, reporters, and spectators rushed back to their seats. Judge Vance felt her heart pound against her ribs. She took a slow breath and straightened her shoulders. Mark reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. The jury filed back in. They looked exhausted, drained by the emotional and intellectual labor of their duty. They refused to make eye contact with either the plaintiff or the defense table, a classic sign that no one could yet read. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who in turn handed it to the judge. The judge reviewed the papers, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy blanket of anticipation. In the matter of Vance versus United States Customs and Border Protection, Agent Kyle Brennan and Agent Sarah Jenkins, the judge began, his voice booming in the still room. On the count of violation of Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure, how do you find? The foreperson stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held a copy of the verdict. She took a deep breath. On the count of unreasonable seizure as to Agent Brennan, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff. A collective gasp went through the room. As to Agent Jenkins, the foreperson continued, we find for the plaintiff. Judge Vance closed her eyes for a brief moment. On the count of violation of Fifth Amendment rights against discrimination based on race, the judge continued, how do you find? As to Agent Brennan, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff. The foreperson's voice was stronger now, filled with conviction. As to the agency, Customs and Border Protection, we find for the plaintiff. The weight of a system had been brought to bear on her, and now the weight of 12 consciences had pushed back. The only thing left to know was the price of that injustice. The judge turned to the final page of the verdict form. And what damages do you award the plaintiff, Eleanor Vance? The foreperson's voice rang out, clear and resolute, in the silent courtroom. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $300,000, and we award punitive damages to be paid by Agent Kyle Brennan in the amount of $5 million. A tidal wave of emotion crashed through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, and the frantic clicking of reporters' keyboards filled the air. $5 million. It was a staggering sum, a number designed not just to compensate, but to punish, to send an unmistakable message. And as to the agency, Customs and Border Protection, the judge prompted. We award punitive damages, the foreperson declared, in the amount of $3 million. Total damages, $8.3 million. It was more than a verdict, it was a revolution. A jury of ordinary citizens had looked at the full power of the federal government, at an agency tasked with protecting the nation's borders, and had held it accountable for the actions of its agents and the failures of its culture. They had declared, with the unified voice of the community, that a badge is not a license to discriminate. They had affirmed that the Constitution is not a document of suggestions, but a binding contract between the government and its people. Judge Vance felt tears welling in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming relief and vindication. Mark Caldwell wrapped his arm around her shoulders in a triumphant hug. Across the aisle, the government lawyers sat stunned, their faces pale with disbelief. Agent Brennan, who was required to be present, looked like a man who had just seen his entire world crumble to dust. He slumped in his chair, a broken figure, the cost of his prejudice now quantified in a sum he could never hope to pay. The verdict was a personal victory, a restoration of her honor, a public repudiation of the humiliation she had endured. But as she looked at the faces of the jurors, tired but resolute, she knew this was something much larger. This victory did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the Martinez family, their wedding gifts searched on the roadside. It belonged to Marcus Rivera, the college student falsely accused of being a smuggler. It belonged to the Henderson couple, whose vacation was ruined by a baseless stop. It belonged to every one of the 19 prior complainants and the countless others whose stories were never even told, whose rights had been violated in secret, their dignity stripped away with no cameras recording and no chief clerk to call. She had become their champion. Her standing, her voice, her unyielding refusal to accept a quiet apology had forced a public trial, and that trial had exposed the rot for all to see. The $8.3 million was not just money. It was a symbol. It was a weapon. It was a warning shot fired across the bow of institutional indifference. It would force changes in training, in policy, in the way CBP supervised its agents. It created a powerful precedent that would be cited by other civil rights attorneys across the country, making it harder for the government to hide behind the shield of qualified immunity. As the courtroom slowly cleared, reporters shouting questions, Judge Vance stood for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. She had been forged in the fires of justice, and when that fire was turned on her, she had not been consumed. She had instead picked up its embers and used them to light a beacon. She had turned her pain into a landmark, her personal battle into a victory for the voiceless. Injustice, she knew, was a powerful and persistent force. But on this day, in this courtroom, the unwavering courage of one, amplified by the collective conscience of 12, had proven to be stronger. The echoes of the gavel faded, but the resonance of the verdict remained, settling into the quiet corners of the courthouse and spreading out across the nation. In the aftermath, there is a space for reflection, a stillness after the storm. We must look back at that sun-drenched highway not just as the scene of an injustice, but as a crucible of character, both flawed and forged. What led Agent Brennan, a man sworn to uphold the law, to such a profound betrayal of its principles? His actions were not born in a vacuum. They were likely nurtured in an echo chamber of suspicion, reinforced by a workplace culture that prized aggressive enforcement over constitutional nuance, and watered by a deep-seated, perhaps unacknowledged, personal insecurity. When faced with Judge Vance, a woman of color whose intelligence, success, and authority starkly contradicted his prejudiced worldview, his ego couldn't cope. His aggression was a desperate, ugly attempt to reassert a sense of dominance that her very presence challenged. Could this have been avoided? Perhaps. If his supervisors had taken the 19 prior complaints seriously, connecting the dots of his aggressive pattern instead of rewarding his proactivity, his behavior might have been corrected long before it culminated in this national incident. If Agent Jenkins had found the courage to speak up, to be a true partner by de-escalating the situation rather than a silent accomplice, the entire tragedy could have been averted with a simple, "Kyle, let's just verify the ID and let her go." And what of Judge Vance? Could she have done anything differently? Had she not been a federal judge with a direct line to the court's power structure, the outcome could have been tragically different. A regular citizen, faced with the same illegal demands, might have ended up arrested, charged with resisting, and lost in a legal system that often favors the word of an officer over the word of the accused. Her story is a testament to her strength, but it is also a chilling reminder that justice in such encounters can depend perilously on one's status and resources. Her victory underscores the critical need for systemic protections, like robust, independent civilian oversight and the reform of qualified immunity, so that every citizen has the power she was uniquely positioned to wield. This story, in the end, is a powerful affirmation that our system of justice, for all its flaws, contains within it the seeds of its own correction. It reminds us that the law is only as strong as the courage of those who demand it be upheld. It is a testament to the fact that one person, armed with the truth and an unyielding will, can indeed stand up to the immense power of the state and bend the arc of the moral universe, however slightly, back toward justice. What do you think is the biggest factor that allows behavior like Agent Brennan's to continue for so long? Have you ever witnessed a situation where you felt someone should have spoken up but didn't? What do you think holds people back? We believe these stories are essential. If you agree, please consider supporting our channel so we can continue to bring them to light.